Okay. All right, good evening, everyone. Uh, we're going to start now. Uh, First of all, let me get this light. No, that's not gonna work. There. I know there's light in the back there. It's driving me crazy. I'm sure it's not going to help you guys any. No, it's not going to work. Okay, so I get a perfect halo effect that way. There we go. All right, but I'm looking at the side. Apologize, but that's the best I'm going to be able to do. I'm going to start right away into the subject matter because I'm not sure how well this is going to get through. I'm using my son's, what do you call it, the Wi-Fi, and it's not as strong as it would like. So I was asked before we started on the main topic to just touch upon the issue of abortion in Jewish law. I posted in the chat the name of a book that if you can find a used copy of it, or you want to take a look at it in a library, you can find it, is one of the best sources around. Rabbi David Feldman was a conservative rabbi, very well respected, a scholar, and he wrote a really fascinating work that delves into all of the issues in accordance with Jewish law and tradition. Okay, I see it's available used on Amazon for some outrageous price, but if you can find it elsewhere, I saw a paperback used for just a few dollars. All right, so let's understand a basic concept you have in Judaism that is often missed by many people. We don't really speak of rights in Jewish tradition. You have a right to do this or a right to do that. That is not really how our sources deal with questions. Jewish tradition is based upon the concept of obligations. What are we obligated to do? And so we are obligated not to kill, not to murder, right? We're obligated to save lives. We have negative and positive mitzvot. Right? So there is no such thing as a right to an abortion in Jewish law. There is the question is, may one perform an abortion? When may an abortion be mandatory? When may an abortion be non-allowed? Okay? So we have to start from that point. And it has nothing to do with who controls our bodies, which is certainly a very important issue in modern discussions of it. But I, as a human being, do not have full control over my body. I can't just cut off my hand if I don't like how my hand looks. I'm not allowed by Jewish law and tradition to put a tattoo on my body. I am obligated to preserve my life. What is the status of a fetus is the first thing that has to be resolved. Since the fetus is contained within the woman's body, the Jewish tradition, for the most part, views the fetus as if it were a limb of the woman. It doesn't have separate rights per se. And if you have, let's say, God forbid, a cancer on your hand or some kind of disease that the only way to save your life is to cut off your hand, you can cut off your hand. The Mishnah, in discussing the question, says if a woman is having difficulty in childbirth, and the baby is not yet entered to the birth canal, the crown is not coming out yet, you're allowed to cut up the baby limb from limb by limb to save the mother's life. And we're talking about an era where there was no cesarean section usually meant the death of the woman. All right, so you don't just do a cesarean section to save both mother and child, because that just was not within the realm of medicine at that time. If you can save both, you have an obligation to save both. If the child has already begun the process of birthing and it's begun to enter into the world, then it becomes questionable as to whether or not you can save the mother's life by taking the life of the child, because now it's an independent existence. The two great scholars of the Middle Ages, Rashi and Rambam, differ in the understanding of what's transpiring. For Rashi, it falls under the basic rubric as the limb of the mother. And since it's a limb of the mother, there's greater leeway for permitting abortions under various circumstances. The Rambam, Maimonides, views the fetus as a threat to the mother's health. And if it's a threat, you're allowed to save one person by killing another person if that other person is a pursuer. And it says in the Torah that if somebody is chasing after another individual, you're allowed to kill the chaser, assuming the person who's being chased is innocent. The law of the rodef for the pursuer. Okay. So let's cut to the basic law here as understood. First of all, you must remember that, as in any case, there will be differing opinions on what may or may not be permitted, but everyone from one end of the spectrum to the other, following rabbinic tradition, says that if the fetus at any stage before birth threatens the life of the mother, not only is abortion warranted, it may be actually compulsory to save the mother's life. Her life comes first. If there is serious threat to the mother's health, but not necessarily clear that it would mean she would lose her life, now some authorities begin to shade away from permission to perform an abortion. Before 40 days after conception, the first 40 days after conception, the fetus is regarded almost like merely water. And so there's even less restrictions that might apply to that early stage. Right? And various more liberal opinions come out permitting abortion for many different reasons. But traditionally, what we have is that if the mother's life is at stake, no question. If her physical well-being is at stake, in terms of her health, both mentally and physically, those might be grounds to warrant an abortion. If the fetus is ascertained to be deformed in some way, that's a big problem area. If it's, again, within the first 40 days, I don't know if you can have such a resolution of the question, deciding that it has a problem, then it might be much more likely to be able to be done. But if it is as a means of birth control, that almost all traditional Jewish authorities anyway, would find to be forbidden. Again, remember that the U.S. Supreme Court and courts that are discussing this are talking about rights. They're talking about the right of the fetus to be born. They're talking about the rights of a woman to have control over her body. So that is a different question. That's a legal question for the legal systems. my problem is that I don't really want any particular religious tradition to be deciding uh, the law for everyone. Different religions have different understandings. And so it's not really fair to have, say, the Catholic Church, which has a much more restrictive interpretation, to decide what the law should be, or other uh, religious entities. It's a question that has to be decided in the secular courts and secular legislatures. Okay, I don't know if that truly takes care of the issue for you, but that's uh, I think is a fair analysis on just basic analysis of the Jewish attitude. Most Jewish organizations are found more on the liberal side of the spectrum and have a greater tendency to favor uh, warranting abortion or leaving it up to the individuals involved. On the more right wing, especially in the very Orthodox circles, they may be closer to those who want to outlaw abortion, except under the traditional uh, rubric of the mother's life being threatened in some way. A number of years ago, there was a case in which a woman was in an auto accident. She was pregnant. The doctors said that the continuation of the pregnancy would be life threatening for this woman. So they recommended an abortion, and some anti abortionists went to court to try and block the abortion from taking place. And as I said, in Jewish law and tradition, that was a perfectly warranted act, and should not have been interfered with, because that was between the woman and her doctors and her advisors that might have the say whether or not it should take place. Okay. If you have a question on that, raise your hand. You have a thing that you wave at me on. All right. Because I'm using my tablet, I can't put all the faces on the screen, so I'm just putting mine on. Okay. Nobody's yelling or saying anything, so all right, we'll go on. This week's Torah portion is Kedoshim, Kedoshim TU. We're said we have to be holy because God is holy. And for me, that is really underlies much of Jewish tradition and law. We imitate God in our actions, and that is what is at stake here when we say Kedoshim TU, be holy. And a lot of the laws that are covered are some of the ritual areas, as well as areas regarding appropriate sexual relations, who one can marry or not marry, incest laws and things like that. All right, tonight is Yom Ha'atzmaut, Israel Independence Day, in celebration of the founding of the modern state of Israel. And we have to understand the background to everything that took place by 1948. And we can go back to the Bible. Throughout the Bible, we find that God promises to Abraham and his descendants that they will inherit the land. And as long as they obey God, they will be granted the right to live there and reigns, etc. And if they don't behave, they can be punished and even exiled, which happened twice in our history. Despite the exiles, at no time ever was were the Jewish people feeling that the land of Israel wasn't theirs. They always felt a connection to the land. In the book of Psalms, we have a famous song, Al Narot Bavel, Sham Yashamnu Gam Bachinim Bezachrenu et Zion, rivers of Babylon we sat and we wept when we remembered Zion. And it says in a Sheikh, if I forget Yerushalayim, I'll put it above all my my hopes and dreams, etc., should my right hand should wither. Right? And so there's never been a time when Jews haven't yearned for Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel. Up until the 19th century, for the most part, this was usually a pious prayer, just as we have even our prayers today, prayers for the establishment of the Jewish homeland. And Jews from time to time did move to Eretz Yisrael and live in different places in Jerusalem and throughout other areas of the land of Israel. And there was relatively no time, or very relatively brief times when Jews might have been completely expelled from the land of Israel. And so throughout history, we've had Jewish communities, larger or smaller, living in various places in Eretz Yisrael. And there might even be large groups that may come in a sense of moving to the land of Israel at various times. But mostly these were pietists. They were not interested in trying to create a new Jewish state. They were just interested in living in the land of Israel, the promised land. The 19th century, which saw the rise of various forms of nationalism, also gave rise to a new vision of Judaism, a new vision of the Jewish people, which falls under the rubric of Zionism. The Jewish dream up until then was mostly a messianic dream. When the Messiah comes, Jews will be able to return to Eretz Yisrael. Until that time, there should be no efforts to try and free the land. There's even a statement in the Talmud that God made an agreement between Israel, the Jewish people, and the nations of the world that they would not destroy the Jewish people, and the Jewish people would not try to take back the land of Israel by violent means. But the situation of Jews in the 19th century, while on one hand it was becoming better, on the other hand, it was difficult still. And so we have various individuals coming up with various kinds of ideas, still monkeying around with this, apologize, to try and figure out what would be the best way to resolve the problems the Jews faced in Europe. So we'll start with a man by the name of Moses Hess. He was born in 1812, died in 1875, and he's known as the father of Zionist socialism. He was born in Bonn in Germany, and then later on, when his father moved to Cologne, he went there. At 14, he joined him in business. He studied philosophy at the University of Bonn, but he didn't graduate. He has helped found the first socialist daily newspaper in Cologne, became its Paris correspondent at the end of 1842, then moving to Belgium in 1845 when he was active in communist activities, and returning to Paris 1848-49 during the uprising that took place then, and later goes off to Switzerland, and off and on, and he returns to Paris where he lives off and on. Now, after his father's death, he had an inheritance that allowed him to have something of an independent lifestyle. He married a non-Jewish woman, and he lived in Germany from 1861 through 63, where he published his most famous work, Rome and Jerusalem. And this was the idea behind the book was a historical philosophical work influenced by Spinoza and the Bible. And he believed that a kind of a socialistic system, as being expressed at that time, would be the means that Jews would have to become part and parcel of the world. And he had various attitudes towards Jews, which changed a number of times during his lifetime. In his early 20s, he felt himself thoroughly German and believed that Jews should assimilate. Later, in reaction to current events, he occasionally expressed compassion for his fellow Jews. His Rome in Jerusalem, he writes, has returned to his people. After personally suffering from anti-Semitism, he turned to the Jewish national concept based on his idea of race, espousing the view that Jews should preserve their national identity in exile while striving for their political restoration in Palestine. The Jewish religion was the best means of preserving Jewish nationality, felt, and should be left unchanged until the establishment of a Jewish entity in Palestine, where a Sanhedrin could be elected to modify Jewish law in accordance with the needs of the new society. The future Jewish state, he wrote, should be based on national land acquisition, creation of legal conditions to encourage work, and founding Jewish societies for agriculture, industry, and trade. Right? So these served as some of the earliest ideas that became later on a very important element of the Zionist program. Now, what goes on in the world outside of the Jewish community itself, or as it affected the Jewish community, was certainly a very important element in creating and pushing eventually the Zionist cause. In 1881, Russian pogroms, which were attacks against the Jewish community, caused devastation in the Pale of Settlement in southern Russia. That's Ukraine today, Belarusia, and parts of Romania, Lithuania, Estonia. And that was, and a result of that was a large immigration, Jews emigrating from that part of the world. In 1882, there was a movement founded in Kharkov, then Russia, now Ukraine, called the Beit Yaakov L'chu V'Nelcha, a pioneering movement. And it was part of this idea of returning to the land. That the Jews had been lumpen proletariat, but what they needed to do was move out of the bourgeois world, out of the world of money lending, etc., and go and become part of the land, work the land, become farmers. So we have the beginning, what is called the first Aliyah, the immigration of Jews from the Russian Empire and Romania to what was then Palestine under Turkish control. This is between 1882 and 1903. And this is really the beginning of the modern Jewish return to the land of Israel, which eventually laid the foundation for establishment of a Jewish state. So some of the causes were, as I said, the devotion of Jews historically to the land of Israel, the pogroms that were taking place in Russia. And
Rabbi, can I ask something?
Yes.
Sorry, just this might be jumping way ahead, but in terms of like that first Aliyah being predominantly Russian Jews, like, isn't there a little irony with regards to how hard it is right now for Russian Jews to be respected as Jews in Israel, and in terms of being accepted by the chief rabbinate and such?
Well, it's hard for Russian Jews in the sense if there's a question of their Jewish background, if that's what you're alluding to. But
yeah,
and the you have to understand the earliest settlers who go to the land of Israel. Many of them were not. Most of them were not religious. The Zionist movement was opposed by most of the religious authorities, but they had grown up in a very Jewish world. One of the most important figures of early Jewish life in the land of Israel and then the creation state of Israel, David Ben Gurion, knew his Bible in Hebrew. What he didn't do out of knowledge. Many of the Russian Jews who have come to Israel in the last 30, 40 years, since the 1980s, were separated from Jewish tradition and often ignorant of much of Judaism, often intermarried, and had different kind of a connection. Some of them didn't want to go to Israel. Many of them ended up going to the United States or other countries, and it was a struggle to get them to go to Israel for many of them. Okay, so if you want, we maybe touch upon that later on the modern problems of Israel today. Okay, so as I said, this first Aliyah was between the years 1882 and 1903. It overlaps the creation of the Zionist movement. But just to get a handle on this, this first, what they call the first Aliyah. Aliyah means going up to the land. Jewish tradition always talks about when you go to the land of Israel, you're going up. So it consisted basically of individuals, small groups, mainly under inspiration of Chivat Zion and the Bilun movement, which were somewhat socialistic and idea of settlements on farming communities. And so some 25,000 people came on this Aliyah in two major influxes in 1882 to 1884, and then again in 1890 through 1891. And by 1903, the end of the first Aliyah period, 28 new moshavot have been founded. Moshavot were cooperative communities. They might own the land individually, but they worked together and sold their produce together. And some 90,000 acres of land had been purchased. There was also the beginning of urban settlements, especially in Jaffa, where 3,000 newcomers made their home. Hebrew was beginning to be a spoken language once again, and the first Hebrew elementary schools had been established. Although French culture propagated the Alliance Israelite Universelle and Rothschild was widespread. Okay? So this Aliyah pretty much ends around 1903, 1904. And during this time, we have Jewish settlements, as we said, in various parts of the land of Israel. We have a very important story, that of Alfred Dreyfus, and that's going to be important with the story of Theodor Herzl, who is really regarded as the father of modern Zionism. Theodor Herzl, born in 1860 and died in 1904, was a Viennese journalist and founder of modern political Zionism. He was born in Budapest, Hungary on May 2nd, 1860. Educated in the spirit of German Jewish Enlightenment, the family moved to Vienna in 1878 after the death of his sister. He received a doctorate in law in 1884 and worked for a short time in courts in Vienna and Salzburg, but within a year he left law and devoted himself to writing, for which he had demonstrated ability from an early age. In 1891, he became the Paris correspondent for the New Free Press in Vienna, an influential liberal newspaper at the time. So he was in Paris to witness the rise in anti-Semitism, which resulted from the court-martial of Alfred Dreyfus, a Jewish army officer who was divested of his rank in a humiliating public ceremony in January 1895. And as the mobs at present shouted death to the Jews. The background of Dreyfus is that he was a Jewish officer, not particularly observant, as very few would be in the army if they were observant, and just like Herzl was a non-observant Jew. There was a lot of anti-Jewish sentiment and what was now becomes known as anti-Semitism in much of the French military. And there was a spy scandal. It turns out it was one of the old school French officers who actually was guilty of the crimes. But they picked out Dreyfus as the scapegoat accused him of treason, accused him of passing on secrets to the Germans. He was convicted twice, sent to Devil's Island. Eventually, he was granted release, but it took a long time and became a very big cause célèbre in French circles, with the liberals generally siding with Dreyfus against the Ancien Regime, as it were, that of that day, and the anti-Semites. So Herzl became convinced that the only solution to the Jewish problem was the mass exodus of Jews from their places of residence. Originally, he wrote that it didn't matter where Jews went. He eventually realized that a national home in Palestine was the answer. So he published a pamphlet, The Jewish State, in 1896. And while there had been suggested solutions to anti-Semitism, Herzl was the first to call for immediate political action. And Jewish reaction to his plan was mixed. Many Jews rejected it as too extreme, although there were those who responded with enthusiasm. And they asked him to head what was to become the Zionist movement. And he succeeded in convening the first Zionist Congress in Basel, Switzerland, August 29th through 31st, 1897. The Congress adopted the Basel Program and established the World Zionist Organization to help create the economic foundation for the proposed Jewish state. Herzl was elected president of the organization and chaired the first 6 Zionist congresses. He spent much of his time in his remaining years, he dies very young, meeting with world leaders, both Jewish and non-Jewish, trying to exist financial and political support for his dream of a Jewish state. He died in 1904, before his dream could become a reality, and in 1949, his remains were transferred to a mountain in Western Jerusalem, which became Mount Herzl, and today is a major military cemetery. So there were a series of meetings of international Zionist congresses, arguments is always the Jewish way of doing things, and different approaches to the Zionist idea. But we had at least the beginnings of what was to become the movement for the creation of a Jewish state in the land of Israel. Interestingly enough, in 1902, the British proposed El Arish as a place for Jewish settlement. And there was debate. The British government suggested Uganda to Herzl, but the 6th Zionist Congress finally put the death nail, the last nail in the coffin of any kind of Jewish state outside of the land of Israel, Palestine. Now, 1904 begins what is called the Second Aliyah, which lasts until the outbreak of the First World War in 1914. So a new upsurge of pioneering fervor as a result of the creation of the Zionist movement came into being, in part motivated by another pogrom, the Kishinev pogrom of 1903 and others 2 years later. Now, the second Aliyah consisted of young men and women, mainly from Russia, many of them so imbued with socialist ideas. These young men and women were guided not only by a more conscious and consistent theology.
That was my contract that it was on. Are you insane?
I'm sorry?
That was actually my contract.
Print another one. I don't care. Don't bring me these rules like this shit. Okay, this pisses me off. You didn't clarify after the phone call, and that really makes me mad, actually.
Somebody's not muted.
What did you just do?
We
not have this fight. Why is this happening?
Because you were selfish again. You got off the phone call and you never clarified with me because it wasn't in your interest to do it. I agree. I can play this scenario out.
It is in my interest.
Why did you not clarify with me after the phone call?
You can mute him.
It doesn't matter. I had a message to one of my partners out there for 24 hours now, which you never clarified with me.
The rule is no Angela.
Then
Hello?
get rid of her.
Yeah, I'm trying.
No, it's not fast enough because you're driving me insane is what you're doing.
All right. There we go. All right. I don't know. All righty. So now we have the second Aliyah, and these were a lot of the people who eventually became the founders of many of the institutions of the later Israel. Now, a lot of these young pioneers of the second Aliyah generally worked as hired laborers in the Moshavot, or cities. They established the first Jewish labor parties, the Poalei Zion, based on the philosophy of Ber Barakhov and Hapoel Hatzair, influenced by the philosophy of Aleph Dalet Gordon. It was also their initiative that led to the establishment of the first kfutza, the first kibbutz. In 1909, they laid the foundation for the first all-Jewish city, Tel Aviv. And the young pioneers of the second Aliyah were also active in the beginning of Jewish self-defense, established what was called Hashomer, the Watchmen's Association. They introduced Hebrew into all spheres of life and laid the foundation for new Hebrew press and literature. This influx, which totaled about 40,000, was interrupted by the outbreak of World War I. Now, was also a couple of things. One, we begin to see a division in the population in the land of Israel. There were those who were referred to as the old Yishuv, Jews, Payetsis, who had lived in Israel, in Palestine for generations, mostly settled in the major communities, Jerusalem, Tiberias, Tzfat, the holy cities, and they were not interested in creating a modern Jewish state. The newcomers were known as the New Yishuv, and they were interested in creating a new lifestyle. They wanted to be farmers. They began to speak Hebrew, not Yiddish, which was or Arabic, which was found amongst the old Yishuv. And they did not want to live on charity. In the center of their world was clearly the old new city of Jaffa, new city of Tel Aviv, the various kibbutzim that were being founded, and the whole attempt to replace the Jewish nation's economic life on a strong, productive basis. Settlements should be built, and Jews should become farmers once again. Now, amongst this group was a man by the name of Eliezer ben Yehuda, who was born in Lithuania in 1858. And after a yeshiva education, he ceased being religiously observant. In the late 1870s, he concluded that the future of the Jewish people was in Eretz Yisrael, came on Aliyah, the first Aliyah in 1881. All his life, he pushed the idea of Jews needing to return to their land and for the living national language to be Hebrew. He published newspapers in which he argued for the need of Hebrew culture and productive life. And he criticized many of the aspects of the old traditional lifestyle. And he insisted that Hebrew only be spoken in his home. He was author of one of first modern Hebrew dictionaries. He coined new words based upon Jewish traditional words to answer the need for modern language. And so he was the founder of modern Hebrew. There are many other names that we don't really have time to deal with, but this period of time began to be threatened during the First World War. Many of the people who had come to the land of Israel at this time were Russian citizens. And when Turkey joined with the Allies against, when Turkey was with the Axis powers, aligned with Germany and Italy, they saw these Russians as being foreign nationals. And so many got expelled from the land of Israel. And indeed, some there were Jews who did indeed spy on behalf of the Allies. Again, it's an interesting story, but we don't have time for. There was a Jewish brigade in the British Army called the Zion Mule Corps, led by Joseph Trumpeldor, one of the members of the new Yishuv. This is in 1915. And in about 1916, the British and French got together in what they call the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which divided the Middle East into spheres of British and French influence. While the Americans thought that the war was to end colonialism, the British and the French saw it as an opportunity to take away from the Germans and the Turks. And so eventually, as a result of that agreement, Palestine, as it was called, became part and parcel of the British protectorate. And while Syria fell to French rule. Now, the British did conquer Palestine in 1917. And the Jews of the world in the Zionist movement wanted to push the British into creating a actual declaration, which was known as the Balfour Declaration, November 2nd, 1917, in which the British government bound itself to the idea of creating a homeland for the Jews in Palestine. Now, it didn't say it was going to be an independent country. It didn't say it was going to be a Jewish country. It wanted to protect the rights of all, but it was the opening of the door to the idea of having a new Jewish political existence. In 1918, Britain appoints the Zionist Commission from within the Zionist leadership to advise them on implementation of the Balfour Declaration. In 1919, Chaim Weizmann, who was a chemist who helped to come up with some inventions that helped the British during the First World War and thus had a bit of influence. He heads the Zionist delegation at the Versailles Peace Conference when the Treaty of Versailles is signed. But right away, there were going to be difficulties. Just jump a little bit, in 1920, we have Arab attackers killing Jews. The British are awarded the mandate over Palestine by the League of Nations. Sir Herbert Samuel was appointed High Commissioner, and the Histadrut, which is a Jewish labor organization, and the Haganah, Jewish defense organization, were both founded. So between 1919 and 1923, we have what we call the Third Aliyah, mostly from Russia. In part, it was a continuation of the Second Aliyah. While earlier the westward road to the United States was still open, those who decided to go to the land of Israel this time did so out of Zionist convictions. Right? It wasn't that they had no place else to go. You could go to the United States still in the early part. But in general, those who did came out of Zionist convictions. So in all, the Third Aliyah brought in 35,000 immigrants, 53% from Russia, 36% from Poland, the rest from Lithuania, Romania, and other Eastern European countries, apart from 800 from Western and Central Europe. Many of the newcomers were graduates of the Chalutz pioneer movements in Russia and Poland. 1921, there are riots in Jaffa, and a number of individual Jews were killed. 1922, the British Mandate confirmed by League of Nations, including commitment to historic Jewish connection to their homeland. But already we'd be seeing actions that were contrary to what at first was promised. The Churchill White Paper was the first division of what was Mandate Palestine. Everything east of the Jordan River became known as the Hashemite Kingdom of Transjordan, although originally that had been part of the Balfour Declaration and Mandate. Now the fourth Aliyah, 1924 to 28. This was a different kind of immigration. This was a rise in immigration, middle-class people, shopkeepers and artisans, mostly from Poland. And this was a result of two developments: the economic crisis in Poland and economic restrictions imposed on the Polish Jews, and severe limitations on immigration to the United States introduced in 1924. So the road to the Americas, the Golden Medina, as it's sometimes referred to, their doors were shut. And so those who really needed and wanted to get out of Poland found their way to the land of Israel. They were not interested in changing their way of life. They didn't want to become farmers. They settled in the towns, primarily in Tel Aviv, invested some of their small capital in workshops and factories, hotels, restaurants, and shops, and in construction. And there was also significant rural development on the coastal plain. New villages based on citrus orchards were founded. So this fourth Aliyah brought about 67,000 immigrants, half from Poland. And then of the 13,000 who, in 1926, however, the influx was halted by a severe economic crisis. And of the 13,000 people who arrived in 1926, more than half left the country. In 1927, over 5,000 people left and only 2,300 arrived. In 1928, the entry and exits were about the same, around 2,000. And when signs of economic recovery came about in 1929, the Aliyah picked up again. And it was this time, around this era, 1924, the Technion, a very important university, was founded in Haifa. Hebrew University was founded in 1925. In 1926, we have the first Hebron riots, which cited Arab crowds against Jewish residents of the town, ended in death and bloodshed for Jewish inhabitants. 1929, Arabs rioted in Jerusalem, massacres of Jews in Hebron and Tzfat. So as a result of this, the British government dispatched what was called the Shaw Commission to investigate. And eventually you have what I call the Hope-Simpson inquiry. You don't need to remember the names, but to understand what's going on. They led to the following: the Passfield's second white paper, the first attempt at British disengagement from the Jewish national commitments of the Declaration and Mandate. And it began to limit Jewish immigration to Eretz Yisrael. 1933 to 1939, which you can see is leading up to the Second World War, initially from Poland, but later mainly from Germany and German-controlled territories. This brought in over 250,000 Jews and transformed the character of the issue. The fifth Aliyah had begun with a small trickle in 1929, but in 1933, when Hitler rose to power in Germany, the trickle became a flood. In the period between 1933 and 36, 164,000 Jews entered the country legally, while thousands of others came in as illegal immigrants. The German and Austrian Jews, which were a quarter of the total, made an important contribution to the progress of the issue. They constituted the first large-scale influx from Western and Central Europe. The majority, 80% of them, settled in the cities and towns, and their skills and experiences raised business standards, improved urban amenities. Over half of the newcomers made their homes in Tel Aviv. In Haifa, the construction of the country's first modern port was completed in 1933, while in Jerusalem, the Jewish neighborhoods were largely expanded. There are a large number of doctors, academics who came to in this a part of this immigration. The majority of the immigrants contributed to who formed the new Philharmonic Orchestra. 20% of immigrants contributed to the establishment of new Oshavot and kibbutzim, and a new type of immigration called youth aliyah was started, bringing in young people who had to flee to the land of Israel. On the eve of World War II, the Jewish population in Palestine was 475,000, approximately 40% of the total population of Palestine. During the time in which immigration was forbidden by, or illegal or limited by British rule, there were a number of illegal clandestine immigration Jews to the land of Israel. And the rise of Hitler, of course, created greater pressure for immigrants. And so the Mossad, during the war years, was organized clandestine immigration by overland routes from the Middle East. After the war, large-scale operations at sea were resumed. All kinds of efforts you can read about to get people into the land of Israel. Now, we have in 1936, the Arabs of Palestine, many of them were disturbed by what they saw taking place. They believed that they were going to lose control over the land. There were Arab revolts, strikes, riots, and Jews organized against self-defense. In 1939, the St. James Round Table Conference in London ends up with what we call the third white paper, rejects partition and envisages creation of two independent states, one Jewish, one Arab. And yet, with I'm not sure how that means they reject partition, but they thought of two independent states. With the outbreak of the Second World War, as David Ben-Gurion said, we shall fight the war as if there were no white paper, and the white paper as if there were no war. Now, as with all revolutionary groups, movements, you have splits. One of the most important one was there was a split with Ben-Gurion's mainstream Haganah and Zionist organization known as Lehi, and they was led by Avraham Stern, and they were much more radical in what they were prepared to do to drive out the British. In 1941, Haj Amin al-Husseini visits Hitler in Berlin and supports his policies. He was a significant figure in Jerusalem. I'm just skipping a lot of these things because it's getting long. The Jewish community had created what was known as the Palmach in 1941. It was a strike force of the Jewish army. Some members of Palmach were parachuted behind enemy lines in Europe. Later, they helped immigrants to coming to the land of Israel. In 1945 and 46, the Haganah, Etzel and Lehi temporarily reunite, making one organized community for fighting. In 1946, illegal Jewish immigrants were deported by the British to Cyprus, placed in deep displaced person camps, which essentially becomes kind of a concentration camp. Not as bad. On July 22nd, 1946, the Irgun, which was led by Begin, Menachem Begin, blew up a wing of the King David Hotel in Jerusalem. And there are two versions of what happened. Begin and his group say they warned the British. The British said they got no warning. There were a lot of casualties as a result. Then some members of the Irgun who had been sentenced to death, and so as revenge for that, the Etzel hung two British sergeants. This is the kind of stuff that goes on in almost every one of, unfortunately, the creation of countries when they have some kind of overship by somebody else. Finally, in 1947, the British were really disgusted with the whole situation. Some favored the Arabs, some favored the Jews, some favored getting out altogether. And so everything was turned over to the United Nations, the new United Nations. And so November 29th, 1947, there was a vote on what to do. And so the United Nations voted to establish a Jewish state in Palestine. And the British government announced its intention to terminate its mandate on May 15th, 1948. So between November 30th of 1947 and May 14th of 1948, really you have the beginnings of the war. And the 14th of May, Arab armies invaded what was to be the two different states of Israel and Palestine. Under pressure not to do so, nonetheless, the Israelis declared the establishment of the Jewish state of Israel, which was then recognized by President Truman and the Soviet Union also a few days later. And then the Israeli defenses were reorganized under the name of Tzahal, Tzava Haganah Yisrael, the Israel Defense Forces. So there really were two periods of time with the fighting. The first bit of fighting, the Jewish settlements were mostly on the defensive. And it was mostly local Arabs, perhaps with some outsiders, against the local Jewish brigades. There was a temporary ceasefire, which eventually was broken. And during the time of that ceasefire, both sides gathered more arms. And eventually, the Israeli forces were able to push back against the invasions of the Syrians and the Egyptians, Jordanians, and Saudi Arabians, and sought to create the outline of the new Jewish state. One of the big battles was over the city of Jerusalem. In the end, Jerusalem gets divided. The old city of Jerusalem, the eastern suburbs of Jerusalem, were in Arab hands. The western suburbs of Jerusalem were in the hands of the Jewish community. And Ben-Gurion declares Jerusalem the capital of the state of Israel. And a armistice was signed, but no peace treaty between Israel and its neighbors. So now begins the real building of the new Jewish state. There are influxes of large number of Jews, 648,000 between 1948 and 52 came to Israel, many of them, as I said, from Arab lands. There was an upsurge of fighting of Fedayeen. Fedayeen would be Palestinians who crossed over into the Jewish settlements area. And eventually you have what was called the Suez Crisis in 1956. Nasser had nationalized the Suez Canal, and Britain and France invaded. Israel too, trying to prevent crossing over from Sinai into Israel proper, conquered the Sinai. At the end, that gave it all back. The British and French, under U.S. pressure, were forced to vacate Egypt. Let's skip over to 1967, the Six-Day War. What happened was, following the Sinai crisis, Suez crisis, the United Nations and many of these peacekeepers were Canadian, were sent into the border areas between Egypt and Israel, and between Syria, Lebanon, and Israel. And Israel was supposed to have had free passage through the Suez Canal, and also through the Straits of Tiran from the Gulf of Aqaba, or Eilat, whichever you want to call it, to the Red Sea. They never got free passage through the Suez Canal. And at that time, Nasser decides to close the straits, to put up, ask the United Nations to remove their peacekeepers, and threatened to cut Israel off from being able to go down through Aqaba. And so the Israeli government decided the best thing to do was to attack because the Egyptians had been mobilized already. Syria was shelling northern Israel. And so the Israeli Air Force had a devastating attack upon the air forces of both Syria and Egypt. And in a lightning campaign, Israel took the Sinai and the Golan Heights. Initially, King Hussein of Transjordan, now Jordan, was warned, stay out of it, we'll leave you alone. But instead, he believed the lies that he was getting about Egyptian victories and Syrian victories. And so he began shelling Israel. And so that was the result of that, was the conquest of the West Bank, which had been in Jordanian hands, part of Palestine of the Mandate. And thus Jerusalem became under the control of the Israeli government. In 73, again, we have a war. This time Israel was caught unprepared. They still had forces on the Suez Canal. The Egyptian army was able to cross over. There was a heavy loss of Israeli aircraft because of Russian armaments, but eventually Israel was able to overcome that. And not only did they get back to the Suez Canal, they even crossed the canal into, on the other side, into Egypt proper, surrounding the Egyptian army. And finally, eventually, what happened was they withdrew, and as a result of this, we eventually have our Sadat, Anwar Sadat, feeling he could find some solace that the Egyptians had done so well in the initial part of the war. In 1977, the Likud, a more right-wing party, comes to power. The first time that the Socialist Liberal Party was pushed out, Labor Party, excuse me. And Menachem Begin becomes prime minister, and Anwar Sadat visits Jerusalem, speaks to Knesset, and they create a peace between Egypt and Israel, with Israel returning the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt. And since then, while there's been tensions to some extent, the peace has held between Egypt and Israel. We had other situations in the north, the Lebanese war, many kinds of things. And in doing all of this, Israel still brought in refugees from various countries, including a large group of Ethiopian Jews who were brought into Israel with the.
Robert, can I ask something again, please?
Yes, yes.
I was just wondering, with regards to like sort of that peace that was established with returning Sinai. I've heard a lot of commentary about that Gaza should have been included in the returning of Sinai, and that there was some debate about that, and that a lot of the violence we're seeing now may have been averted if Gaza was under Egyptian control. I was just curious what you thought about that.
Well, the problem is Egypt didn't want Gaza.
As with a lot of the Arab world, yeah.
Yeah, they didn't want it. One of the claims is always made, Israel prevented the creation of Palestinian state. Well, Jordan had the West Bank from 1948 until 1967, and Egypt controlled the Gaza Strip. What stopped them from creating a Palestinian state then? There was no clamor for a Palestinian state at that point. No Arab nation pushed for a Palestinian state. It's only with the failure of various of the Arabs' attempts to destroy Israel that you really begin to have strong Arab protests, terrorists, and things of that nature. Israel gave up the Gaza Strip. Israel does control certain borders on it. Egypt controls part of the border too. And when Israel gave it over, a lot of Israelis were opposed to it, but Israel finally decided to withdraw. They left an infrastructure that was destroyed by the local inhabitants. And instead of making use of that to build a state, they frittered it away. So I don't hold any water that's the reality is the Gaza Strip. The fact that Gaza is such a thorn in the side of Israel is also one of the motivating factors that prevents Israel from wanting, or many Israelis, from wanting to create an independent state in the West Bank. Because they say, look what happened in Gaza. We pulled out, Hamas takes over, and we keep having rockets.
I know one of the things I've heard just from people who've been in the IDF and others too is that if you want to call it policing, but the Israeli policy towards Gazans versus the Egyptian policy is significantly different. And this is why some people on the more extreme side say that if Egypt had control of Gaza, because they pretty much, they're pretty violent towards Palestinians, right? To say the least. I've seen some pretty rough situations. The Egyptians. Like if Palestinians cross over into Egypt, they just shot dead, right?
Yeah.
And so it's a really, really antagonistic relationship, but nonetheless, it seems to be, possibly something that would have sort of kept that area from boiling over in terms of violence.
I don't know, you can't give Gaza to somebody who doesn't want it.
Right, but and the debate was that there should have been, that should have been one of the conditions for taking cyanide. If you want cyanide, you take acid. If you don't want, you can't take cyanide.
That could be. Look, there are all kinds of what ifs. It is said that David Ben-Gurion, after the Six-Day War, suggested that Israel should get rid of most of the West Bank. Just give it back, get rid of it. Because he foresaw some of the problems that would come about. What we have today is a number of factors. One, historically, the local Arab population was never a strong element politically. They had been ruled by the Turks, and when the British came in, they were ruled by the British. They had no democratic tradition. Much of the land that was sold to the Jewish newcomers was sold by Arabs who are absentee landowners. They owned the land. The lands were farmed by tenant farmers who were Arabs. They got pushed off because the Jews wanted to create kibbutzim and other things. So resentment built up from that. During the war in 48, there were atrocities by both sides. There's no question. If you're an honest broker, you look at it, you'll see both things happen. Now, some of them might be understandable. One, the Israelis always claimed that the Arabs either left on their own or they were motivated by the Arab armies telling them, get out of the way so we can kill the Jews, then you can come back into your villages. That was partially true. Also, what was partially true was that some of these Arab villages overlooked the major road from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And the last thing you want if you're trying to defend that corridor is to have possible enemies up on the hills above you being able to shoot down. So certainly there was a strong effort to convince those who lived in that area maybe they would be better off leaving. So there were large numbers of Arabs who became refugees. There were an equal number of Jews who became refugees from Arab lands, almost 1 for 1, or at least 2/3 in number. There was no effort by the Arabs, Egyptians, Syrians, Jordanians, Lebanese, to settle their Arab brethren in their countries. They kept them in refugee camps. And from 1948 until today, there are refugee camps. In Europe, following the Second World War, there were displacement camps that were there for a while. Populations were exchanged. Germans left certain areas that were returned to Poland and to Czech rule. Other areas, people went back and forth. Many Jews left Europe to save what they could from themselves. And that was settled and taken care of. We have, no other group in the world has great-grandchildren, and even maybe beyond that, of those who fled who are still considered to be refugees. Has Israel always been nice to its Arab citizens? No. Has there been discrimination? Yes. Are Israeli Arabs better off than any other Arab group in the Middle East? Yes. They do vote. They have members of the Knesset. They have members of various positions of authority within Israel. They are not conscripted to the Israeli army, understandably. But then there are the Jews. The Druze population is a different ethnic identity, and many of them serve in the Israeli army and serve in important positions. When you talk to many Israeli Arabs, they have no desire to live under Palestinian rule. What kind of elections do we see taking place in Gaza and in the area that's under the control of the Palestinian Authority? There hasn't been an election in what, decades? So the anger is there. The fact is that facts on the ground are this is what is. Israel is there to stay. It's not going to disappear. It's not an apartheid state. It has its problems, as does every country in the world that doesn't always treat all of its citizens the way they should. But it is certainly no worse than many others. Yeah, it's difficult in some of the communities in the West Bank. And Israeli soldiers can sometimes be too rough. And as you're saying, if the Egyptians were doing it, they'd be even rougher. So I don't know. But that, the world has accepted the Palestinian cause as being justifiable. They don't really understand or fail to understand that you're not going to be creating a democratic country with Palestinian rule. You already see what is there under Palestinian rule, besides the corruption and besides the fact that the elections are far from necessarily free, and there's a lot of very clear mishandling of citizens there. Who would want that? And if to have and for Israel to allow the so-called refugees to come back in, that would destroy what Israel has been able to accomplish since 1948. So, I mean, that is my take on things. Israel is a vibrant democracy. The voices are there on all sides of the issues. Civil rights are much better in Israel. You certainly would not want to be gay, or at least openly gay in Palestinian-controlled territories. Certainly not in Gaza or in most of the Middle East. So, I don't know what the boycott movement really thinks they can accomplish. And it's not, and those who support the Arab cause also say all of the land of Israel, everything from the sea to the sea, is Palestine to from the river to the sea. That means getting rid of all the Jews that are there. So for Israelis, they have to win every war, because if they lose one, that's the end of the story. And that message has not gotten through to many. But you're seeing now, we're beginning to see countries in that part of the world recognize that this is the reality of the world. They're better off having Israel around and to work with Israel than to boycott it and assume it's not going to do them any good. All righty. Are there any? It's been quite a travel here. Are there any questions anybody wants to ask? No? Okay. Anyway, all right, so that will be it for tonight. We'll see everybody next week, God willing. And I will be back in front of my regular computer, and so I won't look so weird, I think. I know I look weird on my tablet coming to me. You guys, whatever I can see, yeah, you all don't look bad. Yom HaSma'ut is tonight, tomorrow, I believe. All right? And you don't celebrate Yom HaSma'ut on Friday. They don't want to have Yom HaSma'ut leading into Shabbat. They don't want to do it Saturday night either. Various kinds of things. So May 5th is the set date for this year. Okay. Be well, everybody. Have a good week. Good night.
Thank you very much, Berman.
You're welcome. End. Okay.